In this video, we're going to be discussing how to pass the MPRE. So if you're a first-time taker gearing up to take the exam, or maybe you're a repeat taker, you're definitely going to want to listen closely. These tips that we're about to discuss are designed to help you be successful on your upcoming exam, and they're tried and true. They've helped first-time takers and repeat takers alike. So let's talk about our first tip for how to pass the MPRE. Our first tip is arguably the most important, and this is something that you should spend some time with before you dive into studying. I don't want you to waste any time studying until you hear me out. So this first tip is we want to make sure that you have a good roadmap about what is tested, and then you should create a study plan accordingly. This is why it's vital that you start here with this first tip. So what I'm getting at here is that not all of the rules are tested equally on the MPRE. There are certain subsections of the rules that are more heavily or frequently tested than others. So while in an ideal world, you would memorize all of the testable rules, we know that we're not living in an ideal world. So what you should do to maximize your chances of success is to figure out the frequency in which these subsections are tested and then plan and study accordingly. You should first focus on those very highly tested rules, committing them to memory. This way, when you see them more frequently on your exam, and they're ultimately worth more points than other subsections of the rules, you are again maximizing your chances of being successful. So while you should try to memorize all of the rules, we really want to place that extra importance on the more highly tested subsections of the rules. So you may be wondering, great tip, but where do I get that information? Well, we've created a cheat sheet here at JD Advising that breaks down for you the frequency in which these subsections of your rules are tested. And we highly urge you to take a look at that and to use it to help guide your study plan and to simply guide your studying. You can use it along the way as well. So I want to point a few things out to you while we're talking about this first tip. So conflicts of interest. This is a subsection of the testable rules, and it is the most highly tested section of your rules. In fact, it makes up 12 to 18% of your total exam. So let me do the math for you on that. There are 50 scored questions on your exam. So 12 to 18% of those 50 scored questions breaks down to about 6 to 9 of your scored 50 questions. This means conflicts of interest need to be your number one priority. You need to memorize them, feel comfortable with them, because this is a great way to maximize your points. The next subsection of rules, litigation and other forms of advocacy. This makes up 10 to 16% of your total exam. Again, I'll do the math for you. That is 5 to 8 of your scored 50 questions. Similarly, lawyer-client relations makes up 10 to 16% of your total exam. That's also tied at second place with that previous subsection I just discussed. So this too is going to make up 5 to 8 of your scored 50 questions. We also have 3 subsections tied at third place for the third most frequently tested subsection. So these subsections are things like competence, legal malpractice and civil liability, client confidentiality, and the regulation of the legal profession. Each of those subsections makes up 6 to 12% of your total exam respectively. That is 3 to 6 of your scored 50 questions each. Next up, tied are the different roles of the lawyer and communications about our legal services. So each of these subsections makes up 4 to 10% of your total exam. That is 2 to 5 of your scored 50 questions apiece. Moving on from there, the safekeeping of funds and other property. This makes up 2 to 8% of your total exam. That is 1 to 4 of your scored 50 questions. Transactions and communications with other persons also makes up 2 to 8% of your exam, or 1 to 4 of your scored 50 questions. Judicial conduct also makes up 2 to 8%. This therefore means it's 1 to 4 of your scored 50 questions. And then finally, the lawyer's duty to the public and to our legal system. This makes up 2 to 4% of your total exam, or 1 to 2 of your scored 50 questions. So the reason I wanted to point all of this out for you is because sometimes people obsess over things like judicial conduct. And that's okay. Again, you should know all of these rules in an ideal world. But if you're comparing the frequency in which judicial conduct is tested on your exam to the other subsections of the rules, it shouldn't be your first priority. So this first tip, to summarize, is understanding how these rules are tested and then creating a study plan accordingly so that you can maximize your chances of passing this test. Our second tip to help you pass the MPRE is to become familiar with the keywords and phrases of the MPRE. And this is information that the ABA makes available. So again, this is not some sort of secret. But what we've found in the past in working with students and tutoring students is that sometimes people get questions wrong that's testing a rule that the student knows. And of course, that's frustrating, right? If you know it, why are you getting it wrong? And what we have found is that they're getting them wrong because they're not reading the question carefully enough. So taking some time to remind yourself to slow down when you're practicing questions so that you're not making a silly mistake, but also simultaneously to make yourself aware of these different keywords and phrases that the ABA will use on your exam is also really important to making sure that you're successful. So to give you a quick example, if the call to question asks, is the lawyer subject to discipline? That's a very different question than the call to question saying something like, is a lawyer subject to civil liability? Let's break that down for a second. If a lawyer is subject to civil liability, that means their client or whomever is complaining about them would have to prove duty, breach, both types of causation and harm. And this is really hard to do. Asking if the lawyer is subject to discipline is testing something very different. It's asking if the lawyer has violated some sort of ethical duty under these ABA model rules of professional conduct, or if the judge has violated one of their ethical obligations as well. So again, understanding the differences between these keywords and phrases is really important to make sure that you are applying the correct rule so that you can get the points. Our third and final tip to help you pass the MPRE is that we urge you to take your professional responsibility class offered at your law school, or whatever the equivalent ethics class is offered at your law school, prior to taking the MPRE. So while I understand that every professor approaches their class differently, and what I mean by that is some professors are going to structure the whole class around that specific state's ethical rules. That's how my class was. Nonetheless, even if you're learning your state-specific rules rather than these ABA model rules, it's going to provide an excellent framework and foundation for you to start studying for the MPRE. It's also going to make sure that you understand the basics of your ethical obligations, and nonetheless will be helpful, even if you have to learn a slightly different rule for the MPRE. So by taking the class and studying for the class, most law schools require it for graduation anyways. It's taking and completing a lot of the work that you should be putting towards the MPRE out of the way anyways. So it's a great way to give yourself a solid foundation before you dive into studying for this exam. So we hope that you found these tips helpful so that you can pass the MPRE, and best of luck on your upcoming exam.